Hello and welcome to the second video in a two-part series of a presentation of MAR, Methodology for Assessment of Remanufacturability, which is an application of the European standard 45553 that was released in 2020. My name is Signe, and today you will join me and Isabella when we present to you our case study results and how we applied MAR on an actual remanufactured product. If you want to know more about MAR and what it actually consists of, I urge you to watch the first part of the series as Johanna and Emma tells you more about that in the first video. But let's get into this second part. We applied the steps of MAR on a case study at Toner, which is a Swedish remanufacturing firm which works with toner cartridges. And we looked specifically at the model that is called CF280X. And the first thing we did in the project was we collected some data. And due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we unfortunately had to do everything digital. So we watched a couple of movies or clips and also did an interview with a person working at Toner in order to understand the process. And what we did with that information is we constructed this kind of process tree where we could identify how the 7 standard remanufacturing steps were actually applied on this specific product. And in the second step, we used the REMPRO matrix, which was introduced in the European standard, to find links between the remanufacturing process steps and the product attributes. And we actually decided to keep the standard formatting that was introduced in the standard rather than filling in with all the 11 steps that we identified from this specific process. And there is a purpose of this, which Isabella will talk to you more about later on in this clip. The third step was to look at the general criteria which are presented as subcategories to the product attributes in the standard and present representative questions that we could use to find the relevance for each of our process steps, which were shown in the process tree. And we did that by looking at how it was formulated in the standard and see how we could ask ourselves if it was relevant or not. So, for example, for the criterion access to parts during disassembly, we asked ourselves, is it important to access parts during disassembly? And we found, yes, that is important for us because parts of the toner cartridge must be disassembled in order to be remanufactured. However, the modularity of parts were deemed as not relevant for us because toner cartridges are not considered modular products. They are part of a bigger product, which is modular, but the toner cartridge itself isn't. So by doing this, we could eliminate a lot of the general criteria and only focus on the ones that were actually relevant for this type of product. And what we did after we had done that was we formulated some criteria of our own. And we decided to split these into 3 different categories. The first one was criteria which we found that the product must fulfill in order to be remanufacturable at all. And the second group of criteria were criteria that we thought that the product should fulfill in order to be well suited for remanufacturing. So there's a difference there. In the first category, we found that if even one of the criterion were unfulfilled, the product isn't possible to remanufacture. But if one of the should criteria were unfulfilled, then you could still remanufacture the product, but it wouldn't be as suited for the process as it would have been if it was fulfilled. And the same goes for the last group of criteria, which we formulated as might criteria. And these were things that wouldn't really have a big impact on remanufacturability, but that could influence the how the should criteria were fulfilled or not. So we thought that they should still be considered. And what we did was we formulated a list that was both divided into the process steps, but also the attributes. So this is an example for process step 4, the disassembly of a core. And as you can see, we have 2 must criteria, and fortunately, CF280X fulfills both of the must criteria, but as you can see in this table, there are some should criteria which were unfulfilled. And if we look at one of them, the second one being there should be indications on where and how to disassemble the product, that is unfulfilled. And that is okay, because yes, it would be beneficial if you could tell from the outside where you should disassemble the product, but you will still be able to do it, even if you can't tell from the outside. However, if you are unable to access the unit using methods that you have available, you cannot remanufacture the product, and therefore the division between must, should, and might criteria. And these categorizations were actually useful later on as well in the calculations we did with these criteria. And Isabella will talk more about them now.
Finally, for the last step of MAR, we score the remanufacturability with the help of this equation. With this, we get the total remanufacturability score, R, from a sum of 3 different calculations, one for each criteria type of must, should, or might. We set a criteria as 1 if it is met and 0 if it is not, and then summarize these with a relative weighted sum. Here we have the equation for the must calculation, and this then summarizes all the must criteria. And to do this, we have 2 different weight coefficients, one for the process steps and one for the criteria types. These calculations are done in the same way for the should and the might criteria. When doing this for all different criteria types, we get a total score for the remanufacturability. And for more details on how to do these calculations, one could look at our written report. To further clarify how to do this, I will now give an example of how we accomplish this with the help of an Excel demonstration. So, here in the first 2 columns, we have the first step of MAR summarized. That is the remanufacturing process for the case study. We then have the complete list of criteria. So, for this first initial cleaning, we have 2 criteria to be assessed. We have then sorted these according to attribute type and type of criteria. In this case, both of these first 2 ones are must criteria. We have also adjusted the weight coefficients so that each criteria is of equal weight. That is, each have the score of 1 divided by the total number of criteria. When doing this assessment, we ask if each criteria is fulfilled or not. In this case, both of these first 2 ones are. So answer yes to these questions, and we see that the must score and the total score adjust accordingly. Doing this assessment for all criteria, we get the total remanufacturability score for the product we are assessing, which we can see here. When we look at the results of the assessment, we see that we have a 100% on the must score. This means that all must criteria are fulfilled, meaning that the product is remanufacturable. We also have quite good scores on the should and the might calculations, and we have the total score of 90%, which shows that the product is very well suited for being remanufactured. Another interesting application of this method is the ability to sort the results using the REMPRO matrix. By doing this, we can see how the different process steps relate to each other and how significant they are. This table shows the number of criteria formulated for each process step and attribute, and it shows the sum of each of them. For example, we see that the majority of criteria are disassembly and assembly type, and that a significant part of them are categorized by the 4th and the 5th product attribute. So when doing this, we get a very interesting application of the results, and we could get a lot of insight into the product. And this has a lot of opportunity for further studies. So to summarize, this is one way of assessing remanufacturability. This is a somewhat subjective assessment, and it would change from case to case. Minor changes made to, for example, the criteria or the weight coefficients might have a significant effect on the end results, and this is something to keep in mind when applying this method and comparing the results. As mentioned earlier, if using MAR, you could get a lot of insight into the product. When looking at, for example, fulfilled should criteria, one could find suggestions for improvement of the design of a product to help improve the remanufacturability. And finally, this assessment method and the criteria used could be applicable to not only toner cartridges, but to many different energy-related products. So that's everything for this explanation, and thank you for watching.